Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Scott Wurzbacher, and today we're going to talk about taking on a challenge, persistence, and setting new records. And for today's guest, this means setting the Guinness World Record for fastest paddle along the full length of the Mississippi River. This is going to be an epic episode. According to the Mississippi Speed Record website, people have been setting and breaking this record for fastest paddle down the Mississippi since 1937. The first time the record was set, it took the team 56 days to paddle the distance of over 2,500 miles. Scott Miller is with us today, and he is the leader of the Mississippi Speed Record team, who made their attempt this year, 2023. He lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he's paddled over 8,000 miles in his lifetime. He's a registered nurse at the University of Minnesota Medical Center, and he's also a massage therapist. He lives with his wife and their cats just a few blocks from the Mississippi River. This is a story about using one's passion and gifts to take on a challenge, never giving up, and persisting until the goal is achieved. Scott, welcome to the campfire.
Thank you.
Man, I am so excited to hear the story there. And there's so much that goes into this. You and I had such a great conversation a few weeks before today when we're having this conversation. For context for the listeners, could you give us a little bit of background of who is Scott Miller and how did this adventure spirit develop in you?
Yeah, you bet. Well, depends on how far back we want to go, but I'm somebody that likes to look at the patterns that come down through the generations, and I won't get too far into it, but there was a time, I don't know, 80 or 100 years ago or something, when my grandfather on the farm in northern Iowa, his dad went to northern Minnesota and fell in love with the pine trees and moved the family up there when my grandfather was just a teenager. So there was a move towards recreation in the wilderness, even back then. And then, interestingly enough, their eldest son, my father, majored in forestry and became a worker for the Three Rivers Park District, which is the Hennepin County park system, and it's on par with a lot of state park systems. It's had dedicated taxpayer funding for generations now. And so the facilities are just phenomenal. So I actually lived on a dirt road in the middle of this massively large, beautiful park in Hennepin County, which is the largest county in Minnesota, for the first 8 months of my life. The poison ivy vines grew 6 feet high in the back, and I don't remember this, but then we moved to a new development being built in the cornfield just to the east of this park. It's all safely within the suburbs at this point, given 40 some years of development, but it's still a park that's I think it's 30 miles by 30 miles. So my dad then got me in the Scouts and took me canoeing on the Minnehaha Creek, which is this 23-mile kind of it's a small world type canoe ride. The water levels have to be right, but it's just filled with rapids and lakes and golf courses and rich people's houses and poor people's houses and parking lots and little lakes and bridges. And so it's just a thrill a minute for hours. And we went on that when I was a kid, and it was just really fun,
How old are you when you took that trip?
8, probably.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. We actually flipped to the canoe, and my dad freaked out. My brother and I were floating in the creek and in the rapids, and all our stuff was floating down the creek. But we've no disaster, actually. I think the canoe actually snapped in half, and my dad had to fiberglass it back together later. So he was a little concerned, but we were wearing our life jackets, and all was well.
Yeah, I love this. And I have to say, so first of all, obviously this is paddling in Minnesota or in your blood through generations. And I have to add, you and I shared this, but just to kind of remind listeners, like this whole podcast was really born and inspired out of a canoe trip that I took in the Boundary Waters of Minnesota. So near and dear to my heart here. That was sort of my first experience paddling and portaging, and yeah, just great stuff. And that's why I'm so excited about this story. Was there, so obviously it was in your blood, but do you remember sort of a moment when you were like, you just knew that this kind of a lifestyle was for you, and that this was something that was just a passion for you?
Honestly, I worked for the Scouts in my 20s, and my best friend Todd Foster and I ran a winter camp together. And as we were becoming kind of best friends, he had grown up in the Scouts and done a lot more paddling than I had. And he said, "Hey, we should go on a Boundary Waters trips." And I had never been to the Boundary Waters, and I was like, "Yeah." So I loved all the prepping, and I got books on the Boundary Waters and books on the different, there's hundreds of different canoe routes, and I liked doing all the planning. We were independently poor in our 20s, and I we planned a 10-day trip, and it's like, well, all the food and all the gear, and we didn't have fancy gear at all. Um, but it was like, this is an adventure, and I think that my friendship with Todd, and then we started paddling on rivers, and certainly, so it's from my friendship with Todd that I think the lifestyle was cemented. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Okay, so how do you go from that to this decision that we're going to go for a world record?
Well, so Todd and I in 2003, we were running this winter camp, and part of the theme was to learn about winter explorers. So he was at the library researching winter explorers, and he came across the book Canoeing with the Cree,
Mm,
which is like the quintessential Minnesota adventure story written by Eric Severide about his trip from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay, where the polar bears live. And Todd read this book and he's like, "We should do this trip." And so I was like, "That's insane. I can't take an entire summer and just go off into the wilderness." And then I thought about it and I was like, "Well, you only live once." And once I committed to it, then it takes months and months. But once you commit yourself to a really big goal, I find that fascinating. Then everything starts to fall into place. But it takes that leap of faith to commit yourself to a big goal first. So in 2005, we did this grand expedition. It was not for speed, but it was a 2,000-mile expedition from literally his backyard to literally where the polar bears live. So like from the very familiar to the very exotic, and it was totally awesome. And then years went by, and we used all the fancy gear we had gotten for that trip to have fun on rivers and things, but never another grand voyage until 2018, I think, when I heard about some guys trying to set this record. I had never heard of this record before. I had paddled on the Mississippi and knew how enjoyable it was. But as soon as I heard the record, it was like, I think I could do that. I'd never before in my life had I thought, I think I could do that. I could set a Guinness World Record. Um, Turns out I was right.
Well, I loved that when the first time you and I spoke, that really jumped out at me because you said, I don't consider myself to be an elite athlete, but when I heard about this, I thought to myself, I can do that. And that just
Yeah.
it really triggered for me.
And as I've thought about it, I think that on some level, I had the feeling like when you do something long enough, the athletic piece of it is still really important, but the other pieces of teamwork and cooperation and planning and good communication and strategy, all of that becomes more and more important. And I thought, I think I can get myself in good enough shape and learn good enough paddling technique, like marathon paddling technique. And I think I have a lot of these other skills around organization and teamwork. And, I was thinking about it, it's like, you can name, all of us can name dozens, if not hundreds, of athletic accomplishments that the world pays attention to. Super Bowl winners, winner of the Tour de France, Jonas Vingegaard. I was just watching the Tour de France. Um, but how many of us can name records for teamwork?
Yeah.
And it's like, this was a way to sort of sneak that in, because I think that was the great strength of my team was our, not just our teamwork, but our community communication, our ability to be vulnerable and lift each other up. So I think we were modeling a different, not just a brute kind of, competitive, like we're just so genetically gifted and so strong that we can set this record through sheer athletic force. No, this was something a little different than that.
Yeah. I mean, I love this. I want to get into this, like kind of the logistics and the adventure itself, this 2,500-mile journey. But I want to go back to something that you said first. So when you were considering this trip up to the polar bears, you said that, it's this 3-month journey. And initially you thought, I can't do that. It was just kind of like, you read this book, but you kind of wrote it off. And then you said, wait a minute, you only live once. And so for that, there was this, no, I can't do that. And it took this sort of convincing. And then fast forward to the world record when you looked at it and said, I think I can do that. And I'm just curious sort of what changed in between the two. But I also am wondering, like, the thought process that you went through when, like, how you got from I can't to you only live once.
Well, I think I was borrowing my friend Todd's confidence. I mean, he at that time in particular was able to think, he had more confidence than I did and was able to have big outlandish thoughts and not immediately dismiss them, which I think is what a lot of us do, and myself included. So I think I was borrowing from his confidence. I don't think I would not have come up with that idea on my own ever in a million years. So it was the courage to say yes to his idea, and doing it with my best friend made that easier. But what I love about the world record attempt is that it was entirely my idea,
Yeah.
and which was great for me. It's like, okay, I have developed some confidence that I didn't used to have, that I could have this idea. And I don't think I would have developed that confidence if it wasn't for that earlier trip, and just a lot of growth as a human being over the last, 15 years. Um, and I sort of recognized it, like, oh, you're having an idea that you could easily dismiss, but maybe don't dismiss it. Maybe stick with it.
So did something change for you between that polar bear trip and this trip that helped kind of shape what
I mean,
happened?
well, so on the polar bear trip, Todd actually got injured, and I took on a much younger guy that we'd worked with at scout camp as his replacement. So I had to step up, and I think having successfully completed that journey, I think that gave me a lot of confidence.
Yeah,
And
the
then,
experience.
in the intervening years, just becoming an adult and overcoming different challenges, figuring out vocation stuff. Frankly, I guess the other two big things that happened is shortly before this record attempt, like just in the last few years before the record attempt, I figured out a mid-career switch. So I had been doing more random jobs, which was fine, but it wasn't a settled thing. And I became a registered nurse. And at nursing school, I met my wife. So I went from a life where I sort of depended on these adventures as like the thing that was the most meaningful thing, and maybe the rest of my life wasn't as fulfilling. Whereas now, my whole life is fulfilling, and I feel like I have a good, well-rounded life. I have a house, I have a wife, I have a good job, and the cool thing about this adventure was, okay, it's short enough. Like if I can become in shape enough, we should be able to get it done in 17 days. I don't have to entirely disrupt my entire life to do this. Just build up enough time off that I can take, excerpt it off, and yeah, so it was kind of perfect. It was like just when I figured out the rest of my life, then it was like, here's the perfect adventure that will fit into this life.
Yeah. And I just have to stop and just honor something you said. You said, my whole life is fulfilling. And this is like a whole thing. You talked about your house and your wife and your career and this adventure and like this sense of fulfillment, but it's a whole fulfillment. And I want to just take a second to honor that because I think that's amazing.
It is. It's really wonderful. I think at the time of the Hudson Bay trip, it was like sort of like, oh God, this amazing adventure is over. And now I have to go back to my regular life, which isn't as fulfilling and isn't as, I haven't figured that out. And so it's nice to have figured life out a bit more and still be able to include adventure in it. It's not like I had to give it up, to be able to have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah,
It's really nice.
it's a real both and. It's amazing. All right,
Yeah.
Scott, there's a real story that goes into the evolution of this whole thing. And I want to hear the whole story and I want listeners to hear the whole story. Again, for context, can you walk us through what it takes and what this paddle kind of looks like. Can you kind of describe the journey itself?
I mean, it is truly an epic adventure. I think it hits me in the same way that a J.R.R. Tolkien, like a grand epic voyage, like Bilbo is leaving the
Yeah,
Shire.
I love that. That's a
Um,
great analogy.
yeah, and because the character of the river changes so much too, I love that it's not just the same thing, particularly in the first 4 days. So I don't know. I guess I could describe the river a little bit.
Yeah, please.
It's 2,300 miles, and the great thing is Minnesotans, we love our state and we love our 10,000 lakes, but we don't think about as often the Mississippi River, which begins in Minnesota, and of the 10 states that the river flows through, the the most number of miles is in Minnesota. So it's really a big part of our state. If we didn't have 10,000 lakes, I think maybe we'd call ourselves the start of the Mississippi state, or
Nice.
something. So it's like almost 700 miles just in Minnesota because it curls around through so much of the state. And it starts in the northern forest, the coniferous, the same forest that's in Canada, that's in the northern part of Minnesota. And in my practice paddles, I've heard wolves howling within the first hour
Yeah.
of the start from Lake Itasca, which is this
Yeah.
iconic location, and it's pretty small. It's just a little creek for the first 50 miles. Then you get to the first town, which is the city of Bemidji, which is very much a forest town, a lumberjack town. There's a huge statue of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox there, and it's very much it's on Lake Bemidji in northern Minnesota. It's just very much a forest town. And then you have three huge lakes you go through, and then you go through a big Indian reservation. You go through still pretty remote areas, and it's 500 miles until you get to the Twin Cities. 500 miles until you get to the commercial river. So a lot of people that live on the Mississippi from points south, they see barges, they see locks and dams. They think of it as a commercial, industrial, dangerous river. But there's 500 miles before you get to that section. So that's a whole 4 days, if you're going as fast as we were, of a certain kind of adventure. Then you hit Minneapolis and St. Paul. Now you're in the commercial area. You've got 29 locks and dams between Minneapolis and St. Louis, and it's a whole nother world. You've got bluffs, beautiful bluffs. You go through this place called the Driftless region where the glaciers didn't go. You've got these pools of water. Every pool is numbered between the locks. So after you go through
Mhm.
lock one, you're in pool one. You go through Iowa. That's a whole journey in itself. Then you get to St. Louis, and then it's 1,000 miles of free flowing river, no more locks and dams, but massive, massive barges. And some people describe that as the largest wilderness in the lower 48 because it can be up to 70 miles wide between the levees, and it's 1,000 miles long. So it's it's just extraordinary.
Yeah. Man, it's crazy. And I want to hear some of the logistics. Okay, so one of the stats that's on the website, your website, is that the very first record was 56 days. And you already kind of let the cat out of the bag. I heard you say 17 days.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so how the heck do you get it from 56 to 17? And what does that look like? When do you sleep? When do you eat? What does that look like for the team?
Well, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this eventually, but a big part of the story is that it was originally going to be a 2-year project and it turned into a 5-year project that included 2 different attempts. So there's all kinds of reasons behind that. But that meant that the strategy that we were employing really changed and evolved over those 5 years through different training trips and the one attempt that was almost successful. Um, but where we landed for this trip, and we even learned things on this trip, is we had a 23-foot canoe. You can use any vessel you want. You can have any number of people you want, but you're limited by the size of the little creek that is the Mississippi for its first 50 miles. You couldn't take a boat much bigger than what we had. And the strategy we landed on was to have a canopy over our canoe in the center part of our canoe that 1 or 2 people could sleep in there.
Oh, wow.
So historically, when people would set the record, like for example, when it was set in 1980 or 81, those guys camped every night and they maybe only camped for 4 or 5, 6 hours and then paddled all day. But our strategy was to sleep in the canoe and take turns sleeping in the canoe so that we could be on the water moving downstream, 24/7 with just maybe an hour or two cumulatively on shore in any given day. Um, yeah,
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And so
yeah,
that's, so you essentially have two people paddling pretty much all the time.
Right. And when we first started planning this, we were going to only ever have two people paddling and two people resting. And that changed so that, for this journey, we had three people paddling the majority of the time. At night, for about 8 hours, we would only have two people paddling and we'd switch halfway through. So everybody got about 4 hours at night to sleep. And then everybody got another 3 hours during the day, usually on average. So at various times, we had 2, 3, or 4 people paddling.
Yeah. Wild. All right. And so you said this ended up becoming a 5-year project. And what I'm kind of hearing you say is that 5 years gave you more time to essentially prepare and practice for the final go at it in 2023. Is that
Yeah.
fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a crazy story. When I first heard about the record in 2018, 3 guys were attempting it. A guy named KJ Milhone, who was like 58 or something at the time, and 2 younger guys.
Yeah.
And they only made it to Iowa before they gave up. They just weren't fast enough. But I reached out to KJ and he to see if he wanted to try again, and he did. And he said, "Hey, what do you think about my 17-year-old daughter being on our team?" And I was like, "If she does all the training, that'd be awesome." So then we recruited another guy from the internet and set about doing training trips and practicing. And then so that was in 2019. And then we were going to do a 2020 attempt. And then the coronavirus came and totally scuttled our plans. Because at that time, there was stay-at-home orders, lockdown orders.
Mm-hmm.
And KJ wanted to still go in 2020, I think, for a number of fair reasons. And he felt like I was breaking my agreement that I had made to go in 2020. And I said, yes, but I'm doing the global pandemic special clause here that
Yes.
couldn't have anticipated. So we had a falling out, unfortunately, and he wanted to still go in 2020. He tried to put together a team and he couldn't. So then we actually had rival teams in 2021.
Nice.
And I think the competition made his team better and made my team better because we were inspired. We were like, we have to be better than them. And as part of their sneaky strategy, they tried to leave 2 weeks before. They did leave 2 weeks before us. So I should explain. There's this whole thing where basically you want to leave as early in the spring as possible because the odds are you'll have higher water, which is faster water. But you can't leave until the ice melts on Lake Winnibigoshish in northern Minnesota. And it doesn't melt on average until like April 23rd or 25th or something.
Okay.
But in any given year, it might melt in March or it might melt in late May. So ideally, you'd have all the time in the world and you just leave the day after the ice goes out. But my strategy was to rely on a very robust support crew and all these volunteers. And so we had a very specific window. So we were always saying we're going to leave May 3rd, May 3rd, May 3rd. Well, in 2021, they had more flexibility because they didn't have as robust of a support crew in part, but they just had a different approach. They left 2 weeks before us. They set the new record. The record had stood from 2003 to 2021 when they broke it. They broke it by almost 8 hours. And then we set off 2 weeks later. And by the time we got to Iowa, we were like 5 hours behind their pace. Then we switched up our strategy so that we would actually be sleeping more, which was kind of counterintuitive. We slept more and then we started gaining on them 2 hours a day. By the time we got to Louisiana, we had a 7-hour lead over their record. And we were optimistic, but there was a tropical depression in the Gulf that spun up 30-mile-an-hour headwinds for days, and we were battling and losing time. And as we were approaching New Orleans, our lead had dropped from 7 hours all the way down to a tie, and the waves got so big that just around midnight, they overtook the canoe. We called the support boat over. We were trying to figure out what to do, and it literally sank out from under us.
Wow.
The waves were so bad, we couldn't rescue the canoe. We were like, just let it go. And the little houseboat we were on that served as our support boat, that was captained by a very experienced pilot who'd sailed ships all over the world. He could not even pilot that thing to the nearest boat ramp that was 10 miles away because the seas or the river was so dangerous. So he ditched out on a little piece of sand, the only piece of sand next to an alligator swamp in between chemical plants. And we spent the night there and finally got off the river the next day.
Man, that's crazy. Okay. So, because they left 2 weeks before you, they were almost done when you guys were getting started. And so
Right.
did you know that they had set the new record, like essentially when you were getting started?
100% we did, because they used the same tracking system that we did that had a public feed. So They pinned, their location was pinned every 2 minutes. So I don't know that they realized this, but one advantage we had, because they left 2 weeks earlier than we did, we could see exactly how much time they were spending on shore,
Mm.
and we knew that we could spend less time. That was we weren't really any faster than them. We had a little lower water levels, but we spent significantly less time on shore, and that so we exploited that and
Yeah.
almost broke their record. Yeah.
But you told me the first time that we spoke that part of this thing is, yes, there's an athletic ability involved, but a lot of this whole thing, in addition to the teamwork, is luck.
Right, and
And
we encountered that this year. So, with climate change, everything is more variable, and that includes the river water levels in the Mississippi River, more unpredictable, more floods, more droughts. And so, like last fall, like just a year ago, the levels in the Mississippi River were dropping, dropping, dropping. And last fall they were so low, they were barges weren't able to go. There's this place called Tower Rock, I think it's called. It's this really cool rock formation in the river, and people were able to walk out to it, which you normally can't do in Missouri. And everybody was like, "Oh my God, you guys are going to be totally screwed." And I was like, I'm looking at the historical record, and I'm like, it is often in flood stage in a spring following a drought winter, so we can't draw any conclusions. And then, sure enough, it was like record high water levels for us for our attempt this past May in Minnesota and Iowa. We had just unbelievably wonderfully high fast water. So, and then the three things you have to get lucky are, you have to get lucky with the weather, especially the wind. You don't want to deal with a ton of headwinds, and you don't want to deal with lightning storms. And we got very lucky on that score. And then you have to get lucky with lock waiting times, because you got to go through 29 locks and the
got it.
barges have priority. So sometimes
Yep.
you have to wait for hours. And then the third thing is the water levels. And we got very lucky for the first half of the river. We had great water. The second half, we had decent to even not, like, definitely not ideal, because when the Ohio River joins the Mississippi, it doubles the flow. And so, if to get lucky there, you get a big push from the Ohio, which is what happened in 2003. We did not have that. So we built our lead in the first half of the trip, and then we just held on for dear life the second half.
I love it. So 2021, you got knocked out by number one, which was weather. I mean, you guys were on track. You caught up. You were looking great, and then the weather knocked you out. Like, what was that like for you and the team, and how did it feel, and how did it fuel you?
You know, the thing is that for me, I really wanted to set the world record 100%, but I also so much enjoyed the process of
Mm.
doing all the preparation, all the planning, all the training, and especially during COVID. Once COVID hit, and I really upped my game. I got a solo canoe, and I was training in Pool One, which is right by my house. And what a great activity for the pandemic, like to
Yeah,
be
for sure.
solo paddling out on this big river. Um, and so, what was the question?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, the weather knocked you out in 2021, and you guys must have been devastated. I was just kind of asking, like, what did it feel like, and did that fuel you, and how did we get from that in 2021 to trying again in 2023?
Yeah, well, what's crazy is I had a totally different team this time. So as soon as, like, it was disappointing, but I also just right away I knew I wanted to try again. And I actually made the decision within a few weeks. People were like, "You can't be talking about that this quickly. Like, that's too soon. We're still mourning." But I was like, I want to try again. And um So it was sort of devastating, I guess, but I still had the fire burning. So I guess that sort of overshadowed any disappointment, was like, I want to try this again. Now, had we failed this time, I don't think there was any fire left. And you have to feel that fire to do something like this. You have to have the passion to do it for sure. Otherwise it'll never happen. Um,
But
yeah.
2021 essentially ended up being like a practice run for you.
Totally, totally, and we learned a ton, and that team was very strong. My teammates were really strong. My teammates this time all had better paddling resumes for long distance races. So on paper they were better, but in retrospect, I'm not sure that they had better resumes. They were great guys. We got along really, really well. Um, but the first team was also great, and we just really just we just got unlucky. So it was on the shoulders of the first team that the record was set in this most recent attempt, for sure.
Yeah. So this is where there's the challenge aspect, and then there's the persistence aspect. And in 2023, you decided you're going to go for it again. Like, we're going to keep going until we get this thing. Well, I want to talk about the team. How did you pull this team together?
Yeah. So the team for 2023. So when it didn't happen in 2020, when the attempt didn't happen, we signed up for this race in Missouri called the Missouri River 340, and it's just this remarkable. It's an absolutely remarkable event. And actually, the guy who started that race some 15 or 16 years ago, his name is Scott Mansker, and he had a dream. And the first year they did this race, it's on the Missouri River across the state of Missouri. The first year they did it, they had under 10 people, and now they have like 1,000 people that do it. And it's like this beautiful grassroots. It's not a corporate feeling event. It's a community feeling event. And there's like half the field has done it before, and they're coming back and doing it year after year. And they organize their whole exercise plan for the whole year around this race, and it gets them out having this big goal. This is what I experienced too, is having this big goal gets me out paddling way more than I ever would have. Like, I got to go paddling today because I'm training for this thing. And so we went and did this 340-mile race, and it was so inspiring to see 1,000 people out on this river having fun. And much like a marathon, everybody has their own goal. Like, only 10% of the field is probably competitive to win anything, right? So other people are like, well, I'm just going to get under 60 hours, or I'm going to get under 50 hours, or I'm going to get under 40 hours. And you got people doing it with their kids, people doing it in aluminum canoes, pedal kayaks, stand-up paddle boards, very expensive boats, very cheap boats, homemade boats, just incredible. And then I went. One of the guys that was on my 4-person team for that event asked me if I would paddle the Alabama 650 with him, which is an even way more crazy paddle race. And these ultra long distance paddle races are a very niche world. This is a very niche world, but that race was extraordinary. And the guys that held the record in the Great Alabama 650, Paul Cox and Joe Mann, I met them, and I just immediately thought, okay, to me, they epitomized for me this example of people who are very athletic, but also have great senses of humor and aren't overly competitive, and they're genuinely kind, open people who can talk about their feelings and have some vulnerability and can really exemplify the kind of teamwork that it takes to succeed in an ultra distance endurance event. Right away, it was just clear. These guys, and I had actually asked them to be on the 2021 team, and they couldn't do it because they plan out their racing calendars years in advance. But when things fell through, I asked them, could you do it in 2023? And by then, they knew, because many people had followed along, that I had a good resume then. Like, oh, this guy now has almost set this record. And so they committed. And then Joe Mann was kind of the key to this whole thing, because he then suggested that the 4th person be Wally Werderich, who he knew from the racing world. And then eventually, for our backup paddler, he suggested Judd Steinbach. And as it ended up, for various personal reasons, Joe had to switch spots. So Judd became on the team and Joe took the backup spot. But that's how the new team came together.
Yeah. Now, this is an all-star team. These are very, very strong and qualified paddlers. This was a team that was going to get this thing done. But one of the things that you talked about when we spoke last time, and part of, making this thing work, was the connection, just sort of the camaraderie and the connection. Can you talk about that?
I think we all came to it with these are the kind of guys that were on the team that are they're very experienced, very good athletes, but they all have pretty well-rounded lives, and they're all open about different sort of adversity that they've had, either personally or in their family. So they're not relying just on testosterone. They like, even though they've got that in spades, So I think they all brought that to the table, and then we did bond through some of the training trips that we went on, and learned how to work together as a team and learned how to lift each other up. But the ability to be able to recognize when another guy needs a hand, or to recognize in yourself that you need a break and not be too macho about it, was just really important.
Yeah, something tells me, Scott, that this wasn't just like you just said, a testosterone fueled, like intense race. Something tells me you guys had a blast.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I will say, it is a dangerous, it's genuinely dangerous. So we totally had a blast. And it's rare that you can relax completely because these barges, especially at night, are sort of terrifying. And we had lots of stressful moments, but I think our sense of humor and our sense of camaraderie brought us through. And in a way, it's sort of fun. It's sort of fun to overcome those challenges
Yeah, for sure.
when
I'm
they're not
wondering.
overly terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could share some of those adversities.
Oh man, I mean, there's so many of them. We had planned to go on May 3rd, but the ice was persistent this spring, and so we ended up delaying to May 7th, and then the ice was still there. So we ended up delaying till May 10th, and we could not delay any longer. And that was all stressful, but it allowed us and the huge support crew that had gathered at my wife's uncle's cabin, which just happens to be located about 100 miles from the whole first, or about 70 miles from the entire first 350 miles of the river, like right in the center. The river goes like this around his cabin. So the support crew could base out of there for the first few days. So we're all at this cabin and we're just like, we were ready to go on the 7th, and then we had to delay until the 10th. And those extra days actually served us really well because we were way more ready by the time the 10th came around. And then thank God the ice went out just in time. So we had to overcome all that stress. And then, we get to Lake Winnibigoshish. It's a 14-mile crossing. It's only 30 feet deep. The waves kick up. People have died on that lake. Many people have died trying to cross that lake. And we had glassed water for the first 2/3 of it, but then the waves kicked up, and the ice went out the day before. The water's freezing cold, and we were taking water over the gunnels, not very much. So I, you know, were we really in danger of losing our lives? No, but we were closer than we wanted to be. I mean, just we go from like everything's great, and then okay, no more having fun. Like we got to get off this lake in one piece here. And then, we had about 30 hours of rain around the Twin Cities, and we were cold and wet and miserable. And we actually figured out that we had a lead at that point, and we stopped at the Treasure Island Resort and Casino, which is a native-run casino, a Dakota-run casino. And I didn't realize they have their own marina that's in a backwater. So if you leave the main channel of the river, like we left the main channel, we went in there, jumped in their showers, and got right back on, which was just fun.
Nice.
And then we get to Lake Pepin, which is one of the other large lakes the river flows through, and we had unrelenting headwinds for that whole 5 hours. And I was in the bow, which is your engine, and like the other guys are more athletic. They should have been in the bow, but I was in the bow, so I got to be the engine, which was fun, but also stressful. I had waves crashing over my face and chest every few minutes for 5 hours, and I remember at one point I was like, "Guys, can we just stop on shore quick and I could take a leak?" And they were like, "No," and I'm like, "Oh." And then I remembered that, okay, I can set my paddle down and take a leak in the canoe. Even though these conditions are extreme,
Yeah.
they can handle, like, normally that's not a problem, but in these 3 foot, 4 foot waves, it didn't feel like I could do that, but I actually could. So that was probably the most physically demanding part of the trip for me. And then we had a night of fog that was incredibly difficult to deal with, and we had a scary time at Lock 15 and these really heavy currents that threatened to pull us through the dam. And then we had some incidents with barges that were somewhat close calls, and other times of headwinds, and yeah, lots of
Yeah.
things.
And I'm envisioning the mental side of this. Like, to what extent did fear and doubt come into play at all for you?
Yeah, I have a distinct memory of late one night. Well, not that late. It was like 10 o'clock at night. It was dark, and the wind was whipping, and there was barges around, and we had two support boats with us that really helped a lot because they could communicate with the barges and the locks and help keep us safe. And it was time for us to find a place to land on shore and switch positions in the canoe. And we ended up on some island, and the wind is roaring, and the support boats are stressed out because they're not sure they can get into this island because it's a little too shallow. So we're trying to help them, and everybody's just totally exhausted. Sleep deprivation is probably the hardest part of the whole trip. And I'm looking at it and I'm just like, I don't know that we can get off this island. The waves are so big, and everything just felt like really stressful in that moment. And it was 15, 20 minutes. We're trying to figure out what's going on. And like some of the guys are like, we need to take a break on this island. Other guys are like getting pissed, like we need to get back out on that river right now. Because there was tension at times
Yeah,
between more aggressive perspectives and more safety perspectives,
sure.
right? And in that was one of the acute moments for me. And we just got lucky. The wind died back a little bit and we all got back on the river and it was okay. But there was lots of times like that where you could feel some tension starting to develop amongst the guys. Yeah.
Yeah, and how about the confidence side? Like, how much of that journey were you dialed into hitting the goal and breaking the record? And,
Well,
did you
fortunately, my teammates and I were all I picked the right guys. I mean, I'm the kind of guy that once I set a goal, it never even occurs to me to quit. Like it's like not an option. I don't incapable of that, you know? So, and these guys were the same way. So there was just never any question.
Yeah, I love that. All right. Well, so
Yeah.
let's fast forward to the end of the 2300th mile, right? And you're coming home and you're getting ready to cross the finish. Can you talk us through that? What was that like?
It was so much more extraordinary than I had ever imagined. Our support team, which was like 17 people or something on shore, and then these 6 more people on these support boats, we hadn't seen the shore crew much at all for days because we'd just been dealing with the boats. And so we missed them and they missed us. And we're south of New Orleans. The river turns back into wilderness. You're in the Delta. So it's really a unique environment. And the sun went down and the support team really wanted to charter a boat so they could be there at mile marker 0, which is about 100 miles south of New Orleans. It's 20 miles south of Venice, 20 miles south of the furthest southernmost point you can drive to. So the only way anybody could join us at mile marker 0 was going to be on a boat. And they were trying to make arrangements and they called up the commercial fishing places and stuff. Can we get a boat? Can we get a boat? No, you can't get a boat. It's the first day of red snapper fishing season. They're all booked. But what happened is everybody took their boats out and all caught their limit during the daylight hours, and the boats came back and they said, we got a boat. So they chartered a boat and they put like 45 friends and family and support crew on this boat. And they joined us like 2 or 3 hours before the end, and we couldn't see them because it's dark, but we could hear them cheering. And without us even talking about it, all 4 of us, once there was about 3 hours left, it was like being in a wind tunnel hurricane. Like I was in the stern and I was just trying to steer and hold on because the 3 guys in the front were just like, doosh, 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 and we're all just totally exhausted. But the adrenaline at that point was overwhelming to have 45 people on our left side cheering for us and 2 or 3 other support boats, everybody cheering. And the river, is just terrifying at night. And eventually you learn to understand. And this attempt, I understood the river so much more even than the first attempt. 3 a.m. in the morning, you've got red lights, green lights, white lights, and can you decide which of those lights are 30 feet away, which are 100 feet away, which are 2 miles away, which are on shore, and which are barges and which are bridges? And if you spend enough time on the river, you get pretty good at making those discernments, but it takes a long time. And so even at the end of the river, there's equipment in the river for dredging and barging, and there's ocean-going vessels. It's dark. The team that set the record in 2021, they got sucked out of a side chute in the last 20 miles, another place where bass fishermen have literally died getting sucked out the river because it's like this distributary delta area. They got sucked out and they had so much adrenaline, they were able to paddle back up into the river, which is like totally insane.
Wow.
And then they got sucked out again and paddled back up again. So we were like, oh my God, we cannot get sucked out any of these side chutes. And the boats are trying to keep us safe. And everybody's on the radios like, go right, look at that green light. You got it. Don't no, the second green light, and they were cheering and paddling and paddling. And then you get to mile marker 0, and it's like this 20-foot high wooden structure with buoys and lights on top. And nobody even talked. Like we just pull up next to it and like everyone's screaming and cheering and filming. And it's the middle of the night, like 3 a.m. And we clamber up on top of this and sign the book up there that's someone put up there for anyone to sign. And it was all on Facebook Live, and it was just amazing.
It had to have been completely surreal for you guys.
Completely. Yeah.
How did emotion play in for you?
At that point, I mean, it was just all adrenaline and all it was just totally awesome. Yeah. It was such a wonderful way to end the trip.
Yeah. It's incredible. All right. So Scott,
Yeah.
what was the previous record? What was the 2021 record?
So forever I had the 2003 record in my head. Then I had the 2021 record in my head, and now I only have hours. But I can tell you, we set it at 16 hours. 16 days, 20 20 hours and 16 minutes. 16 days, 20 hours, 16 minutes, which we broke the previous record by 23 hours and 30 minutes. So theirs was 17 days, 19 hours and 46 minutes, I think, something like that.
Yeah. And you guys just got some news last week that your record is official.
So awesome. So totally awesome. It is now Guinness official. So if you look up fastest paddle, or Guinness actually uses the word row, which is another whole silly story in and of itself. But if you look up fastest time to row the length of the Mississippi River by a team, you will see pictures and stuff of my team and our names.
It's
Yeah, pretty
amazing.
cool.
Congratulations. It's such a huge thing. I'm curious, what does it mean to you? Like when you kind of reflect back on all of this whole story, like your grandfather moving the family to Minnesota 80 to 100 years ago to today, like what's changed for you and what does it mean to you?
Wow. Great question. I mean, to me, uh, it's just incredibly satisfying that I know that I decided to do this, and to be able to make it happen is just a tremendous source of confidence for me. As somebody who hasn't always had the greatest confidence, that's the biggest satisfying thing for me, and also to know that we did it using teamwork and using the support crew filmed a bunch of video and put it on our Facebook page throughout the whole trip, and I think we ended up having tens of thousands of people following along, and I think they followed along because they could tell that everybody was having a good time and was committed to the teamwork aspect of it.
Yeah.
And when support crew members talked about the trip afterwards, they said it was so incredible to be part of something that was so positive and where people treated each other so well. So if that's the legacy of it, that's awesome for me. I think that's
Yeah.
really cool. Yeah.
Well, that's just a piece of your legacy because you've got some other things that are going on as well. What's next for you and what else do you have going on in the world of paddling?
So, well, two things. One, we had a documentary film crew come with us on this trip, and so I'm so excited to see what they come up with. The documentary is supposed to come out next spring.
That's
Uh,
awesome.
yeah, Wilderness Mindset was their name, and they worked their tails off getting all the footage, and they had some drone footage, and it's just really neat. So I'm excited about that. But the other thing is that my best friend Todd Foster and I, who paddled the Hudson Bay in 2005, and he was the lead advisor for the record attempts, um, we started a series of canoe events and kayak events on the Mississippi River in Minnesota because we wanted to share sort of the magic of the river, and in particular the magic of getting out on the river with other people in a boat you move yourself. And so we've done that 2 years now, the second weekend in June, and we set up all these events. So we've got stuff for everybody from beginners to an ultra endurance race and everything in between. So we've got something for everybody, and it's been very gratifying. The people that have participated in it so far, we had about 200 people from like 15 different states and provinces come this past June, and everybody loves it. Everybody, the magic that I feel when I'm out on the Mississippi River, it's clear that it's not something just for me, it's for everybody. So it's very gratifying that all these people come and are like, oh yeah, this was, I mean, I think it's available to you on any river, frankly. I think adventure is available right outside your back door, right close to you. You don't have to go to Mount Everest to experience a grand adventure. But the Mississippi River happens to be in my backyard, so it's fun to share the beauty of the river with these with other people that come from all over. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what I love about this is like I see this as this is something that you're passionate about that you've gone all in on. You've set the world record for the fastest paddle on the Mississippi River. But this is what the hero's journey is all about because now like you're sharing this passion with other people. And so you've got this event. It sounds like you've done it 2 years. It sounds like it's going to stick, going to happen again next year.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have a website.
Yes, twopaddles.org, TWO paddles.org has all the information. And we'd love to have people come to beautiful Minnesota. It's in June, and tends to be very beautiful here in June. Not too hot, not too cold. Really nice.
Yeah, and this is the Mississippi River Paddle Weekend.
That's right.
Yep, twopaddlers.org. So this is awesome. I love this story so much. And I want to ask you about advice. And one thing that I heard you say was that this trip and setting this record gave you confidence. And then you caveated it by saying, as somebody that hasn't always had that confidence. So I wonder if you could speak to the people that are feeling that kind of pre-confidence piece where like, man, they're not feeling the confidence. What advice do you have for people that are inspired by what you do, but are kind of in that place where they're lacking the confidence?
I think start small. If whatever it is you're trying to do, just start small. You don't have to set a world record. You don't have to go 2,000 miles, but start small and grow from there. I mean, that's why when I say it was a 5-year project, it's like all these little pieces had to happen over the years to build up to actually doing it. And then I think the other thing is, nobody really does very well on their own. So find someone who can help you in whatever capacity that is, whether it's a paddle partner or a strategy partner or someone just to encourage you or to talk things through, and find somebody for whom. I mean, that's the other big lesson I had to learn is many times I would feel guilty that all these people were helping me. Like, what have I done to coerce them into helping me? And eventually I just had to realize, like, they are having fun. They are genuinely enjoying this. This is an adventure for them. They are bringing their own expertise and their own passion to this project. And there's nothing wrong with that. So it's sort of, it's sort of cheesy, but that old phrase where like, what, I don't even know how to say it right, but by letting your light shine, you don't make everybody else's lights cower in the shadows. You invite them all to shine as well and make a brighter light together. And I think it's sort of a cheesy phrase, and yet actually does seem to be true. Everybody that was involved with what I did over the 5 years really had an enjoyable time, and I learned from them, and they learned from me, and so yeah, that's some advice.
And they couldn't have done it without you. You couldn't have done it without them. And together,
Right.
all of you all have inspired other people, myself included.
That's so great.
I think that's the beauty of it. So Scott, if people want to find out more about Mississippi Speed Record or you, what's the best way for them to do that?
There's a couple ways. If you go to MississippiSpeedRecord.com, we got a ton of information there. That's our website. And then our Facebook page, if you just search for Mississippi Speed Record on Facebook, you'll find it. And what's cool about that is the support team did a lot of Facebook Lives every day of the trip. So it was like a television show, a reality television show for 17 days that a lot of people watched. And you can really get to see the different parts of the river and how everything worked. And then twopaddles.org is the website for information about the Mississippi River Paddle Weekend, if you want to come paddle with us in Minnesota.
That's awesome. Thanks. You've lived this epic life paddling and creating this Mississippi River Paddle Weekend, breaking a world record. Like, Scott, Hollywood's going to find out about you and they're going to make a movie about you at some point. And I want to know when they do, who's going to be the Hollywood actor that's going to play you in your movie?
I choose Matt Damon.
Yeah.
I've always thought he was the intellectual man's action hero. Yeah.
Love it. I love it. Matt Damon. And what's your movie going to be called?
Well, that's harder for me to think about. I don't know. This is cheesy. I wrote down "Listen to Your Heart" because none of this would have happened if I hadn't listened to that voice inside that said you could do this. And what I mean by that is listen to it, acknowledge it, and then actually do it. So who knows what is going to be passionate for anybody? It could be becoming a ballet dancer. It could be becoming an Antarctic explorer. It could be becoming an artist of some kind. Whatever it is. But I think it's making enough space in your life so that you can hear that voice and then paying attention to it when you finally hear it.
You are speaking my language. That is what we're all about here at Inspire Campfire. It's about listening to that voice inside that calls us to adventure.
Yeah.
And having the courage to act. So Listen to Your Heart starring Matt Damon. I'm going to go see that movie. It's going to be awesome.
Awesome.
Yes. Scott, thank you so much for sharing your story with me today. For those listening, I hope you have been inspired today as much as I have. I hope Scott's story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell or you need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review and sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thank you for listening. Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.